pressing record, and yeah, just wanted to tell you that we'll be recording the session. So if you don't want to be recorded, then please do switch off your video now. And yeah, just be aware that we will be uploading this onto YouTube, and so yeah, good to be aware of that. So welcome to our second monthly learning event from the Digital Fund. Really excited for this panel we've got 4 wonderful panelists. 3 of them are from organizations that we are funding at the Digital Fund, and one of our panelists is from one of our support partner organizations that we work with in supporting our grant holders in developing technology responsibly. So a couple of kind of Zoom hygiene reminders. One is, please do keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. I've already talked about the recording. I'm going to give a quick kind of framing, and this is kind of orientation and welcome. After that, we'll have a brief check-in, which is going to be different to last time. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for 5 minutes and allow people to meet each other just for a quick hello. And then we're going to kick off and have about half an hour of discussion with our panelists who will introduce themselves shortly. And then after that, we'll open the floor for questions where people can unmute themselves and ask our panelists a question. But just before we go into breakout rooms, I thought I'd just give a little bit of a context, a bit of framing, which I know is probably superfluous for most of the people here, because I can see there's a lot of grant holders and people from that we work with at the Digital Fund in the audience. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Digital Fund, we're a small fund, a relatively small fund at the National Lottery Community Fund. And we have funded 29 organizations in the UK, 29 grant holders in 2 different strands. One strand of our grant holders has been funded to undergo kind of organizational transformation and change to become future fit. And the other strand has been, the focus has been to fund organizations to develop technology and to scale that technology. And the 3 panelists who are here with us today from Best Beginnings, Carefree, and Open Food Network are all strand 2. So they're all focusing on scaling an existing piece of tech. So part of the ambition of the Digital Fund was to forge a new social contract between civil society and technology. And so a really big piece of this is that we want to support our grant holders in developing technology responsibly, and actually kind of support and fund responsible development of technology for positive social impact. And part of how we've done that is through working with .everyone. And we're really lucky to have Alex here, who works with .everyone, who has been delivering consequence scanning workshops for all of our grant holders as part of their funding. And you'll hear more about what that methodology and practice is, and then hear from our grant holders about what it's been like implementing that. I think that's all I'm going to say for now. But I think for me, this topic is really interesting because technology has been born in a very particular kind of culture in Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of the kind of culture that surrounds technology there that isn't necessarily what we want in kind of civil society technology. And I think it's just very interesting to think about and discuss what responsible innovation and responsible technology can look like in the way that we're working with it in this sector. But that's what I'm going to say for now. I am going to send everyone into a breakout room. You'll be in a breakout room with 2 other people, so in groups of 3. And I've done this quite a lot of times before, so I'm hoping it's all smooth. And I'm just going to suggest that you take 2 minutes each just to check in with your name, where you're calling from, and what brings you to this webinar. And I'll put those in the chat in case you need reminding. So in a second, you should have a little prompt to go into a breakout room, and then you'll have a prompt to come back, and then we'll start our webinar. So see you in 6 minutes. Great. Is that everyone? Looks like we've lost some participants in the meantime, which is a bit worrying. Hope we haven't. I hope that didn't put people off, but that you got a chance to meet some people you might not have met before. Great. So we will start our panel, and to start with, it would be great to hear from each of our panelists a little bit, just introducing yourselves and telling us a bit about your organization and if you're a grant holder, the technology that you're developing. Oh, here we go, everybody's here now. So yeah, we're going to start by hearing from each of our grant holders about themselves, their organization, the technology that they're developing, and from Alex, it would be great to hear about the work that you've been doing with Everyone. But we'll start with Matt, if you want to go first.
I'll mute myself. Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Black from Best Beginnings. We are a second strand grantee with the Digital Fund. Best Beginnings is a charity focused on reducing child health inequalities, kind of based on the evidence that a parent who's informed and confident can trump a parent who's got a higher income or comes from a more privileged background. Based on that evidence, we're trying to tackle the child health inequalities that still exist in society. We're doing that by trying to increase the confidence and capacity of parents to look after their children and help them to give their children the best possible start in life. The charity is now 13 years old and has always been working in kind of creating, delivering, disseminating resources, which were originally video. We created a lot of film series around perinatal health and safety, including From Bump to Breastfeeding, which went out to every NHS trust in the UK, and Small Wonders, which was a series of films on premature babies and the experience in NICU wards. And from those days of DVD film creation, we've slowly moved on to creating things like e-learnings, website campaigns, and then in 2014, with our big library of content, we then created the Baby Buddy app, which was actually originally funded with money from the big lottery, now National Lottery Community Fund. In those last 6 years, we've obviously gathered a lot of learning and understanding about what works well with parents, who we're reaching successfully with our content, and we know that we're reaching more vulnerable groups of parents, from BAME communities, young parents, and parents not speaking English as their first language. We have higher representation of users in those groups by birth cohort, and higher levels of engagement in the app amongst those groups, which is really good in terms of us hitting the our organizational objectives, but challenging then to understand exactly what we were doing 6 years ago that made that so effective, when there's a lot of change going on in the organization over that time. But now, 6 years on, we are a grantee again from the National Lottery, and we're building a new app, which will take a lot of the learning from the first app, expand the content from what is currently conception to 6 months, supporting parents, to a child's 5th birthday, support more parents, so including a dad's pathway, and also interoperating with child health records to create a digital red book for parents. So there's a lot of different moving pieces in our project now, and consequence scanning has been a helpful element in kind of structuring the work that we're doing around this now. So it's a good time to be talking about it.
Great, thank you. And we'll hear from Lynn next.
Great, hey. So yeah, my name's Lynn Davis and I'm part of the Open Food Network. So we're also grant holders, Strand 2 grant holders with the Digital Fund. The Open Food Network, what we do is we work to create better food systems, and we do this largely through digital innovations. So our users are groups like farmers markets, community food hubs, or community groups, farm shops, community supported agriculture, bakeries, mutual aid collectives, groups like this that are kind of working to create food systems that work for their communities. So we do this because we want to support innovations that bring more diversity to our food system. The kind of concentration in the food system through supermarket oligopoly is essentially not working, right? It's creating a food system that is really bad for people and really bad for the planet. So by the software tools that we create basically are aimed to make these innovations in food, these kind of social innovations in food, more possible. Yeah, so we've been doing this for 6 odd years, and we have a web platform that is deeply featured for food systems, and our work is in kind of supporting these communities to develop efficient systems as well. Kind of what is the appropriate scale, how can you leverage the assets in your communities to create food systems, because food is such a low margin product. It's an incredibly challenging space to work in. And so, yeah, with our role being bringing food systems online, you might expect that the last 5 weeks have been about the busiest weeks that we've ever experienced. Yeah, we've seen a 7-fold increase in pretty much every metric, from turnover to website hits to yeah, basically everything. So and we've scaled, and it's been an incredible 5 weeks for that reason, that we've been able to support that scaling. Yeah, so I think that's about it. That's me.
That's great, and really great to hear about the massive surge in demand, and I guess also how important it is when in a big rush to scale to keep stuff like the responsible piece in mind. So yeah, it was really relevant to have you guys. Charlotte, well, let's hear from you next about Carefree.
Hi everyone. So Carefree is a relatively new charity. We're just over 2 years old, and we've been working on the question of how do you get unpaid caregivers access to time off to look after their own well-being. And we've really been, like Lynn, looking at a systems approach for this. So how can we leverage private sector assets from the hospitality industry to gift those breaks and have a seamless mechanism for it? How can we create new pathways for caregivers to identify themselves and get access to resources without having to go through some of the means testing that they have previously had to do with the public sector, but also really trying to strengthen public sector capacity at the same time in terms of leveraging new resource to kind of build more capacity for a more sustainable kind of social care and home care system, because I'm not sure many people recognise that 3 in 5 of us will perform a caregiving responsibility at some point in our lives. And, you know, we really have an aspiration to try and make sure that when our time comes, that there is kind of collective, shared and kind of community resources out there for us to be able to draw from.
Awesome, thank you. And with that, I will pass to Alex to introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Alex. I love about Zoom that you actually figure out who is who and what names are for somebody who is name challenged. That's a really wonderful thing. So I'm a coach and I'm a creative consultant, and with a squiggly portfolio career, I think, is the new buzzword. And I wear a lot of hats, and I'm here today wearing the hat of being an associate from Everyone. So I think most of you know Everyone. I think I've probably seen most of you in one of the consequence scanning sessions, which is brilliant. Really enjoyed those. We are a responsible think tank, and I think the way that we talk about us often is that we're very passionate for better tech for everyone. The name is in the program. And I think as partner of the National Lottery Fund, what I got really, excited about was to work with all of the charities to really explore what does responsibility mean for each and every one of you? How can you align your organization around an image and a visual of responsibility for your organization? And then how do you translate that into action? And for me, responsibility can really only be translated into action if there is shared responsibility, so that everybody really understands what are the decisions we want to make, and something that I think we coined to a certain extent, how would we not only like our organization to behave, but actually how do we want our technology to behave? And I think when you start to think about things that way, they become very human. So in the workshops that we've run, a lot of time was spent on exploring how do we want our technology to behave and for whom. So looking at different stakeholders and looking at, if we were to do this, what would potentially be a consequence for stakeholder A versus stakeholder B? So that's my life at the moment. And I always give the warning, the problem with consequence scanning is that it is addictive and you're starting to run your life through it. So I actually have a consequence scanning wall next to me. I'm at the moment organizing my dad's 85th birthday, online, remote, mapping out intended and unintended consequences and how to design for a great birthday and how to mitigate a disastrous birthday.
Amazing, thank you, Alex. And I think that's a really good thing to point out, that this can be used across all areas of life, actually, not just technology. And I know after I participated in Alex's consequence scanning workshop, I just kept, it was kind of like a buzzword in my head. I kept thinking about, well, what are the unintended consequences in this situation? And it was like, yeah, it's really a thing. I think the first question I'd like to put to all of you is like to kind of talk a little bit about why it's particularly important to do responsible innovation as the leader of a social mission, and as as organizations that are being funded by public money. Maybe we could just start there if you've got any thoughts or reflections. And any of you can go first, whoever wants to go first or feels particularly called to answer.
I'm happy to have a go. I think, and I've been writing about this a little bit because once we'd done the consequence scanning workshop with Alex, and we thought, great, we're going to go back to the office and just run this session, and it's going to be great, and we're going to highlight a bunch of hidden consequences that we haven't really thought about the way that we're working in our face-to-face services or digitally. But then we got back to office and we thought, no one's going to have a clue what we're talking about, because consequence scanning doesn't mean anything to anyone unless you've been to that workshop and kind of seen it in practice. So the kind of kickoff exercise that we did with the team was to run that exercise around acceptability and unacceptability, and it started to raise questions, and maybe Alex will talk about that later, I'm not sure, but it started to raise questions about our responsibility, our collective responsibility as an organization, and it raised questions that a lot of the team aren't discussing on a day-to-day basis, and they may well be aware, because working in public sector, we find that we are attracting people that are socially conscious to come and work in our organization already. They have an awareness about the public investment that's going into their job and is paying their salary or putting the roof over the organization's head, and aware of the innate responsibility to the public, but I don't think it's a topic that we consider often enough as an organisation, and we're doing it more and more. And I'm now waffling a little bit, but I think it was more about just raising the question as a team about who are we as an organisation responsible to, and how can we be accountable of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And Matt, how would you say things have changed since you went through the consequence scanning process? Like, have you noticed anything, and what has that change been like for you and your team?
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier today, and I think one of the main impacts that consequence scanning's had on the team as a whole so far is that it's adding a bit of more structure to projects and little elements of projects. We're trying to implement them at, obviously you've got to be flexible and schedule them when's going to work within the evolution of a project, but they're adding sort of milestones in projects. So in kind of a discovery phase of a project, or every time you're slightly changing something that you've already delivered, it's adding structure to the way that we're working, and it's making sure that we're going back to other members of the team that aren't involved in that project to get their views on the work that we're doing. So yeah, I think structure and kind of breaking down a sort of level of siloed work that we can end up doing in a project. We're inviting members from teams that we don't typically work with to come in and discuss topics that they aren't responsible for directly, but they are because they're part of the organization, and they bring a different perspective to some of the work that we're doing.
That's interesting. And it reminds me, Alex, in the workshop you did say that for the consequence scanning sessions, it's good to get a really high, like the most diversity of people within the organization, because that, with max diversity, you can have all of these different perspectives that you might not otherwise have. I think before, I have lots of questions, but I feel like maybe we should start with you, Alex, of just to give people who may not be familiar with the practice and the methodology. In the workshop you used Tinder as an example, and I just think like using an example to talk through maybe a bit of what consequence scanning is and the session could be helpful. But if if you'd like to talk about the session in a different way, please do what you think is fit.
No, it's great, and I think I'm actually going to take off where Matthew left it, because I think you're absolutely right. The more of the sessions we ran, the clearer it became that actually the first thing we need to get people to experience is those moments of tensions where, different decisions can lead to different consequences. And what is actually happening when these conversations are not openly had? What happens when you just have that decision? And we developed an exercise. Internally we call it walk the line. And it is a little bit like a constellation for those of you who do that at times with their coaches. So we are going to give people a scenario, and you're giving very little information around the scenario, very much like real life. Yeah, we're getting something on our desks and people say, this is what I'd like you to do. So one of those scenarios, very simple, I'm just reading this because I don't have that on top of my head, is, for example, we used in a scenario, and we asked people, a time management software that is implemented in your organization maps exactly how everybody spends their time, and it is going to share with everybody else who everybody else spends their time. And that's the only information we give you. And then we're drawing a visionary line, and we're going to say one end is highly acceptable and the other end is highly unacceptable. And then we step back and we say, put yourself on where you are on that line. It's a continuum. Where are you? You can do that online really beautifully. You use Zoom or any other whiteboarding methodology, and you just draw it, and then you get people to put symbols on that line. And what is really interesting is just to observe what happens, because there's a couple of things that happen. People shuffle. People are very uncomfortable, kind of, you see people moving from very acceptable to very unacceptable. People watch what other people do. And then I generally say stop. And then I ask people, so why do you stand where you stand? And what is becoming really interesting is that people tell themselves their own stories. So they're starting forward and they say, well, we would assume that a time capturing platform would obviously capture time in a way that might then allow management to evaluate whether or not that is time well spent or not. Well, we didn't say that in our scenario, but that is how reality works. People create their own stories. They do their own consequence scanning. We often all do consequence scanning in our heads. We just don't call it like that, right? There's an action, and an action has an effect, a consequence. And unless we do it together, everybody else will see their own consequences. And there is no platform in a team or an organization to actually talk about that. So that is a great basis to kind of explore with people why that is really helpful. It's really nice that Matthew said that that helped the team to actually go, yeah, it would be helpful to have this as an official practice where everybody can look at the same action and come up with different consequences. Did that answer your question, Phoebe?
Yeah, I think it's great just to get into the nitty-gritty of what that practice looked like, because it was quite an experiential workshop, you know, like it's hard to just talk about it in an abstract way. I was just imagining actually how could we do it on Zoom with, like, you know, hand signals, and, you know, it could be very interesting.
And it is really interesting. We've just been doing it with another client, and we had very cerebral leadership team, incredibly smart people who are considerably smarter than I will ever be. And when you have those conversations with them on an intellectual level, that's beautiful. The moment you get them to walk the line and you get them actually go and put yourself on whether that is acceptable or not, people started to become quite skirmish. And that, I think, is a real insight, that responsibility is ultimately personal. And there is an incredible, I think, an incredible challenge in organizations who don't have these conversations openly, because what we are seeing is that there are increasing amounts of people who feel as if that responsibility for technology lies on their shoulders. And I think in healthy organizations, that responsibility needs to be shared, and people need to be comfortable that the organization has shared collective responsibility. And I think for that, coming back to your original question, it's really helpful to have as many voices in the room as possible, who from their background and from their own empathy to different stakeholders can just see different consequences.
Thank you. It really strikes me that this is, even though it's very easy to think that ethics and technology is a kind of technology thing, it's very much a very human thing. And you touched upon that in your introduction, but it's, I think, you know, there's that quote about how humanity has, you know, technology, the strength of gods, but I can't remember what the quote is, but that actually our technology has evolved so quickly, and we're in such a rush to solve problems, because especially in the social sector, you know, we're on a mission to you know, reimagine the food system or provide care, you know, provide breaks for carers or whatever it is. And we actually, these practices that you're speaking about seem really important, because they allow people and organizations to flex and grow this muscle of just being aware of the kind of trade-offs and tensions that all of us have to navigate all the time in everyday life. And I know something that really stuck with me after the workshop, Alex, was around ethics and principles, and the difference between, you know, this is right and this is wrong, versus, like, actually, you know, things are not black or white, and we have to make compromises all the time. I'd love to ask, out of the grant holders, you know, what are some of the tensions or the places where you've had to navigate, like negotiate different tension points, like scale versus care, or are there any places that you could talk to where you've had to navigate a tricky tension around the technology that you've been developing?
Hey, I just want to first say around power dynamics, actually, particularly in relation to the engineering team versus the service design or the product team, and how consequence scanning or putting engineers in the shoes of the users and some of these decisions that you're trying to make is very helpful for, engineers can get very attached to their technical solution that they've come up with for how they could solve an engineering problem. And that can be really divorced from the user experience that you're actually trying to create. And it took a long time for us to be able to shape a relationship with our engineering team where they were aligned with our concerns and strategic approach, particularly around some service design elements, but also around what is a suitable, broader technical strategy for a charity given the resource constraints that we have. In terms of those questions of how do we build. So we really applied consequence scanning in the first instance, not so much to service design, but questions on how do we build what we want to build in a way that is going to be responsible use of investment, a responsible use of resources, something that builds flexibility and to be able to change our product very quickly and seamlessly without having to kind of go put a heavy load into the engineering bucket. And I think that the consequence scanning kind of that kind of helping us to shape our technical strategy, coupled with some other agile principles, particularly around gathering user feedback, testing hypotheses and assumptions. So where a consequence scanning exercise can really help you to articulate the shape of an idea that you feel is appropriate for your organization, you still need to test whether that is actually a problem that your beneficiaries feel and that they want you to solve. And you need to take that kind of second stage deeper into to be able to really kind of ensure that you've got that kind of feedback loop going around, and that actually what gets built in the end still has that kind of wider voice of your beneficiary built into it.
Thanks, Charlotte. I saw Alex nodding quite a bit. Alex, was there anything you wanted to add there about the agile, the kind of partnering of consequence scanning with agile practice, or anything else? You're on mute.
I think I might unmute myself. I think the beauty about consequence scanning is that it is like a good board game, right? It is actually super simple, really easy to learn, but very, very hard to master. Agile has sometimes a very similar ambition. And I think one of the things that Sam Brown, who I work with, who's actually, I think, also here, has done brilliantly is to translate consequence scanning as a methodology into an agile practice, and using exactly those parameters, creating a event, 45 minutes, fast and furious, fast and focused, to allow people to use consequence scanning throughout their development process, but also at the very beginning, at conception, to start to get better in it, because as I said, like a good board game, you're getting better with it the more often you do it. And I think we talked a lot at the moment about consequence scanning around mitigating things. One of the reasons why I get quite excited about the methodology of consequence scanning is actually to align behind the intended consequences. So also use it really as an innovation tool, and to explore what is it actually that we intend to happen. And can we make sure that we design for that we focus on intent. Obviously, yes, mitigate what we don't intend, but it is a real innovation tool. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I mean, most of my questions are really just to get all of you guys to share your awesome wisdom. So if you hear me ask something and you just want to there's something you want to say, I definitely trust all of you. Matt, I can see.
Yeah, I'm flashing on unmute. I didn't know whether to start speaking. I just, what you're saying, Alex, designing with intent is, I think it's something that probably, I think you sit down at the table at the beginning of like the kind of the feasibility stage of a project, and you've got all of those intentions in mind, and quite quickly your list of desired, requirements in your product reaches the floor, and it's just out of control. And when you actually get to working on delivering that, you're going to be balancing cost, impact, quality, like breadth of the product to who you're supporting, for how long you're supporting them maybe, and all of a sudden all of those intended designs or elements of your product design maybe slowly getting too expensive or just falling out of scope. And I think I guess that's another way that consequence scanning at that early stage and being quite ruthless in doing that consequence scanning can be really helpful. And practically for us, that's been really effective. We have this app that's now 6 years old that had lots of different features within it. And on reflection, I personally think that 6 years ago, we were trying to do a lot of things quite well. And 6 years on, we've learned that we need to just try and do those. With our learning, we've informed ourselves on what we need to focus on and what we need to do really well, and then iterate on top of that. And if we try and do too much, if our intended design list gets too long, then we may end up wasting resources.
I'm really keen to bring in Lynn here, because I've had many very interesting conversations with Lynn back before lockdown, where we were talking about what it's like to be a charity trying to innovate with technology and how different that is, and the kind of challenges that brings. Yeah, and I'm also just very curious to hear about the kinds of the challenges that you're facing needing to scale so quickly, and how that links to this theme of responsible technology. So that's,
yeah, sure.
you.
Yeah, so I guess so OFN is not actually a charity, but I think as a social enterprise, we work in pretty much the same space, a space where users can't necessarily afford the tools. So it pretty much opens up the same world of problems where you're dependent on funding from where you can get it, basically. And so that's really like driven a lot of what we do, partly because like getting something like government funding really puts a lot of responsibility on creating public goods, creating things that are non-reducible, non-excludable. They're things that everybody can access and use, because using state funding for things that aren't public in that way is, I think, a bit of a travesty. So yeah, like putting that at the center is really important to us, and that means open source technologies as much as possible. But I think more so as a charity or social enterprise, things that you can do around, like what you have is a values mission, which can really work to your advantage, right? So we as the Open Food Network, we see ourselves first as a community. And that has really, like, it is a really important aspect. We're a global community of people working with the same aims, because it turns out that a lot of the issues we work on are the same in lots of places. And I dare say that a lot of charities are in that same boat, at least with Global North countries, if not with the whole, countries all over the world. Which means that we have the ability to pool our funds from a global resource, essentially. We work with, there's an Open Food Network community in Australia, Brazil, Jordan, Germany, Catalonia, France, South Africa, India, the list goes on. And so because of this, we can pool our funds and prioritize our work in an agile way. It brings its own set of challenges around prioritizing what to work on next, and kind of coming up with agreements. But I think because we do this work as a community, the things that we end up prioritizing are better, and putting in that extra time, kind of making those agreements, doing and seeing what the consequences are, not just in our own place but in other places as well, makes what we come up with better for everyone. Yeah, and I guess like the other thing that we prioritize as a social enterprise is openness, which I touched on a little bit with open source, but I think that it goes a lot further to all of our handbooks, all of our processes. Our Slack is public, our forums are all public. Yeah, and that actually is one of the key things that's helped us scale right now, because we have all of these incredibly open user guides and documentation on how to do all of the things that the Open Food Network can support with. It meant that in this time when suddenly, like, thousands of people a day were getting in touch saying, hey, we need this now, we could just ping off links to things that we'd already created because we've been prioritizing openness in our community for so long. Yeah, it really helped us to respond quickly. And I think it took a lot of conversations of like why we prioritize so much documentation, but it really came into its own now. It really helped in this kind of time of rapid change. So I think that's a key takeaway if anyone's starting on a tech journey. And the last thing, I guess, is about building wisely in this sector, because building software is the most expensive thing you'll do. It's not like, and like this, people have touched on scope creep. Your scope can just keep growing and growing if you want to solve everyone's needs. So building wisely is just so important. And that means that you can't develop everything for everyone. You just literally can't do it, which is why consequence scanning comes in as such a good tool, kind of helping you to prioritize. We kind of tie it in with our ease value matrices. So how hard is something? How much value does it deliver? But also what are the consequences? And that helps us to prioritize what we're going to do next. And in the knowledge that we can't do everything, how can we make what we do as useful as possible? And that means doing things like developing a really clever API, like how can we be as interoperable as possible so that other people who make other tools can interoperate with us, and we don't have to do the accounting software, we don't have to send newsletters or build distribution routes. There are great tools that already do that. So this kind of open API, exposing as much as you can and being as interoperable as possible, means that you can focus on your core product and more easily deliver value. And again, this is something that's been really useful at the moment, because people have needed emergency features like collection time slots, or everything shifted to home delivery overnight. And so if we, because we prioritize this, suddenly we could make these pivots and just emergency implement different features for people so that they could adapt and their food enterprises could do what they do best, which is reaching their communities.
This is, Charlotte, yeah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn, because I feel like there's such a brilliant contrast between the approach that Open Food Network has taken and what we've taken. I think our observation is that for, there's 190,000 charities in the UK, and for a lot of those charities, actually the social need that they're trying to meet is not it doesn't necessarily require a new tech solution. It just needs a much better way of doing something that really speaks to good values of service design. And we kind of have always been trying to build ourselves as that template of, if you're really going to take like a no-code approach or a SaaS-based approach of plugging together lots of different tools to be able to form the base of kind of an overarching operating process that can ensure that kind of distribution and effective service design and delivery, then that's our goal, without taking on kind of technical debt or trying to build something new. So there is some stuff that we've had to build, and we try to keep that as minimal as possible. But overridingly for us, it's been about really just understanding user journeys, user stories, translating that into business requirements, and then finding no-code tools or SaaS products, like software as a service products or platform as a service products, that can perform those functions for us. And generally speaking, the functionality of those things is going to be far bigger than something that you can build or develop yourself. Lots of companies are offering massive discounts got to confess that Joey, who's on the call today, has managed to really sweep up in terms of COVID, in terms of asking suppliers for discounts on software services. So, you know, software that would have cost us like $800 a month in a user license we're getting for free and things like that. But I think that there is what's termed, and it's kind of Howie Liu, the founder of Airtable, that's kind of coined this. It's the democratization of software happening within Silicon Valley, where these new companies coming through that are basically giving other people, other companies, other organizations the ability to do what they would have had to have previously custom built before. And if we can just really highlight those sets of tools and things for the charity sector and help organizations to build them into how they operate, I think will go a long way in achieving getting charities focused on these kind of questions around consequence scanning for service design, and really thinking about digital transformation of their service design and delivery, more than feeling a pressure of how to become kind of a product company that's got engineers and backlog and velocity charts. Not to say that I'm not trying to introduce velocity into the team right now, but yeah.
Nice. So I think it would be a great moment to open the floor to questions, because I know there's a lot of really great tech thinkers and people and yeah, great people here. So if you have a question, maybe just raise your hand and we can unmute and ask your question. Partly looking at John, because I know John's got a long history of working in innovation and ethics and responsibility, and it would be good to hear from you too.
Okay, so Phoebe knows where I'm coming from this. I've worked in ethics and responsible innovation in biotech, in particular biotechnology developments, particularly around advanced biotechnology and science, some of which is actually very relatable to the current pandemic situation. One aspect of an awful lot of what we do within this high-grade, high-level biotech, one has to be exceptionally ethically aware around. For example, gene modification and so on. And so looking at the intended and unintended consequences along those lines has been very important. I also work in AI and machine learning, where again, there's other aspects. But one area where I've been focusing on just recently has been, I want this for a quarter of the price. That actually has a consequence on other people's lives and livelihoods. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, the internet connection isn't.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
And that aspect of things is something that I'd like to explore a lot further.
No. John, we didn't quite hear your question, but if you want to put it in the chat, just because you're fading in and out.
Oh, I'm sorry. So my question would be, how far do you go in looking at the unintended consequences of bartering to a low price?
How far do you go in the unintended consequences when bartering the low price?
In bartering to a low price for software or services?
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you that a lot of people are bartering their prices with us at the moment, and it's hard. It is really hard. I understand why people are doing it. I understand that. But yeah, just to throw in there as a person on the receiving end,
yeah,
that there are consequences, and software is an expensive thing to create. So yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Very quickly, but one question that at .everyone we really like, because it's a mean little question, which is actually, what would happen if everybody would do it? which is that wonderful counterintuitive question to traditional service design, where you're very much focusing on one persona and the impact of a service onto one persona. The moment you start to ask, well, what would be if all our users would do that? Or what would be if all of our suppliers would do that? That might or not get you to an interesting state, especially also to that question, John.
Interesting. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask any of our panelists? I did see a question here from Hannah earlier on asking, do you feel consequence scanning has helped you to build a better product? If so, how?
I can't tell you for sure because we haven't finished building it, but it feels like it's helping. It's helped us to collectively as an organization review our product principles and communicate them really clearly to the developers that we've begun working with and our designers, and to kind of alongside all the technical chat that happens in our daily stand-ups, to actually have our engineers actually reflecting on what is going to be the impact of this line of code that they're writing is really nice. Previously, kind of my role in these daily stand-ups was to dumb things down and say, what's this going to mean to the user, rather than talking about specific APIs or languages and interoperating and things like that. But now I've found that our developers are actually jumping straight to that and kind of thinking about the user before they start a conversation about the technical challenge at hand. So I feel pretty confident about where we are now, and I think I mean, we're hoping to launch in January next year, and I guess any time will tell.
Yeah, to jump in on that one, I feel like one of the things it's done is helped us have better conversations with some of our users, people who want to have specific features that they want to pay for, like they want to give us the money to build the thing that they want. And we're able to have a conversation around how, even though they can pay for it, it doesn't necessarily fit with our vision, our strategy. We have a better set of tools to talk about it with them, and can help kind of guide the conversation into things that everybody wants, that they could also contribute funds towards, instead of the specific thing that maybe doesn't have the same positive outcomes for as many users. So yeah, on that other side, on the user facing side, I feel like it's been useful as well.
Nice. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Lynn. Charlotte, I wanted to ask you about values and kind of building tech in line with values. If you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there are essentially cross values that you need to be aware of. So on the one hand, you've got the values that your board will have, and in terms from a governance perspective, and the kind of confines of what the expectations are for your charity, and needing those to be really clear. I think we've done a lot of work on trying to make sure there's alignment between our board's understanding of what we term as our business team values for how do we make decisions, and trying to make sure that when they're making decisions, they're using the same framework that we are. So some of those values cover things like collaboration and commitment to the wider sector and ecosystem, making sure that we're creating shared value across all of our stakeholders in what we build or develop. There's kind of three others: our ethical footprint, so really also being very aware of our own supply chain and footprint, representing the interests of caregivers in policy and practice. So those are the kind of values that the business team use that we're trying to get our board to kind of really mirror. And they also help when we're making decisions or we need to unblock issues around intended or unintended consequences, what most mirrors our kind of our internal value set in those decisions. but the technical team also needs to have a set of values that really speak to them and speak their language. And I think that you need to find a way to translate what can be a little bit more ethereal for them into things that they can actually use and practice themselves. And then, finally, I'd say that as a manager, I'm also really trying to reinforce what was the overarching goal of that product, and just continually reminding the team, what was the issue we were trying to address. If we're really focused on unearthing hidden caregivers, then what is it in our products and features that's going to help with that? And just reminding people, like, aside from the kind of, tasks or deliverables or kind of key project outcomes, really kind of bringing it back to the kind of overall focus of the kind of linking back to the bigger picture, and making sure that that's a message that I'm reinforcing, so that they're always connecting up as they're making independent decisions and they're empowered as a team, that they know what we're aiming for. How many users are we really trying to reach? What problems are they facing that we're solving? And yeah, getting everybody, I guess, being really aware of what sits within their own. I guess when you think about technical build, everything's done on what's your acceptability criteria. Here's your task. Here's your key feature or function that you're trying to build. Here's the acceptability criteria, and here's the test. Actually, like, we need to kind of make sure that we have that kind of like JIRA style framework in some of the stuff that we do across the organization as well.
Nice. I think that really speaks to the, like, you can have all sorts of lofty kind of values and goal, ideas of what is right and wrong, but actually when it comes to an engineer, making a decision in a day of what to do or what not to do, you need to have those kind of shortcuts or principles. Actually, Alex, I think it would be great to pass to you. And also Sam, if you want to weigh in at any point, please do.
Sam, weigh in. You and me, I can't see you at the moment, but when you weigh in, you come onto that kind of board that I see of people. So the people who work with me get a little tired, because I think I say this through in and out. Values are codified beliefs, and that's beautiful. However, I can be slightly controversial at times and say, do we really want to build organizations where we all share the same beliefs? Discuss. Principles are codified behaviors. Yes. As a team, we need to agree on the behaviors that we want to actually follow. So I really like talking about principles. Now, obviously, principles are informed by beliefs, so it's not as binary as I'm just facetiously put it out there. But I think the other thing about principles is that they really need to reveal intent. And that's where I become a hard taskmaster, helping organizations write good principles. Because unless a principle doesn't reveal the intent, it again can just become very, I think is the professional term for it. And I think the ones of you who were in the workshop have had the doubtful pleasure to kind of spend an hour starting to write principles. And I'm always very, very mindful of how hard that is. And I remember having people in the workshops who got very frustrated about going, that is actually really hard. But I think, as Charlotte said it, but also as Lynn said it, once you've done it, it is such an amazing resource that people will use. And if you have principles that reveal your intent and you share that with people who work with you, but even more so partner with you. I've just worked with a company who actually now set themselves collaboration principles, and who go, whenever we are going into a collaboration with somebody else, what we do is we show you our principles if you show us yours. And that's a beautiful conversation, because it is a conversation in a psychological safety zone. And it is a conversation that flashes up really quickly. Where are there tensions? And I think as long as you benchmark, attention in itself is not a bad thing. It's actually something that we just need to be aware of, and how do we deal with that? So also writing ourselves principles around how do we deal with tensions. So yeah, I could really, I would love to actually hear from anybody, whether out of the workshop or out of some of the other great work that you're doing, have you started to go on to a journey of writing yourself principles, and how is that going for you?
So at Best Beginnings, we've done that. That was kind of I think there was sort of a lot of those principles. They, you know, codified behaviors. They're behaviors that were evident in a lot of other projects we'd done in years before. But I think it was kind of the exercise of extracting those behaviors and picking out the ones that were really effective and brought on the impact that we'd intended to achieve. And we managed to, I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but we managed to bring our digital product principles down to just 7 key principles. And a lot of them originally started out saying things like, we need to think about accessibility, or we need to think about quality assurance, but we felt that that was a bit too wishy-washy, and we had to kind of go back to that notion that a principle is a codified behavior. So how are we going to behave? We're going to ensure our accessibility standards meet the NHS and NICE guidelines for digital product design, and more of kind of a action-based principles is what we ended up with.
Yeah, I think that it's a great one to actually show, to really reveal intent. I think the other sometimes not danger, but maybe danger is that people feel that principles and values are something very holy. Holy things are lovely, but they're also very scary. And, you know, don't feel bad about having a principle that isn't beautifully articulated. I think, and copywriters have a lot to ask for at times, and I used to be a copywriter, so I'm allowed to say this, because some of those principles are beautifully articulated, gorgeously, right? And you sit there and you go, but mine sounds a bit scrappy and not very, it's okay. As long as absolutely everybody in the team understands what this is about, it is perfectly fine. Don't get scared. The other thing I love talking about, most people know that, is what does good enough look like? Yeah. So instead of writing yourself beautiful principles, write yourself good enough principles and live by them.
Nice. Sam, do you have anything you'd want to add to the discussion about consequence scanning and principles and intent and behaviors?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me into the conversation. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear all of these stories, and I'm pleased to know that people have been benefiting from the work that Alex has been leading so graciously and so well. I think the other thing we've touched on quite a bit, but when we talk about intent and we talk about principles, it's important that you can show that you have done the work of thinking through that intent a bit more to the end and weighing that and considering it and balancing it also, again, with the unintended. And so that's where that concept of unintended consequences constantly comes back in. So a principle or an intent must cost you. And so knowing what that cost is and balancing that out and being able to show to your team the thinking and the thought that has gone into that, and modeling the type of behavior that you want to see in decision making as you set those principles is really important as well. So it's about the how just as much as it is the outcome and the what.
Nice. Well, we have about 10 more minutes before we want to close. Simon, is that a question from you? Simon, you're on mute. I will unmute you because I have facilitator power.
Thank you. Sorry. Building on what Sam, Alex and Charlotte were saying, I'm interested to what extent consequence scanning is helping you prioritise resources and where those resources come from, particularly for smaller organisations. Because I think that's always a challenge, whether it's about a particular element about technical expertise or just supportive thinking space, or even the freedom to get that headspace. Because let's face it, the crisis we're in at the moment, prioritization is kind of one of the key things we need to deal with. And we need more resources than we've got, and that's a big challenge if you haven't got a lot of headspace to think about it.
Is that aimed at anyone in particular, or just to the whole panel?
To the whole panel.
I would look at kind of a broader range of design tools for that sort of kind of factoring out on terms of what how are you prioritizing resource spend. There's some great, there's a platform called Luma Institute, LUMA, and they have like a 30-day free trial, and they basically give you access to all sorts of design tools. But one of the ones that I find really key is a way to kind of look at what's the important, what's the urgent in terms of all your different component parts of a project, and then being able to place like a very good value framework, like in a 1 to 7, so that you end up with a quadrant that's really helpful in terms of what you're going to focus or tackle. But I think design thinking is a very, very, very special and somewhat nascent area for the charity sector to be engaging in. But there is some really beautiful ways of organising thinking and helping you to run your organisation with those sorts of tools.
Thank you.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
I'll just kind of add in that I think in general, at a time of crisis is the exact moment when you need to find and create that space for thinking. This is the type of actions where the decisions you make in the crisis moments actually are what forms the ethical basis of your entire organization. And so it's not really a luxury, and it's a false trade-off in terms of needing to act or needing to think. It's actually that you need to do both.
Yeah, I guess there's that saying, crisis has a tendency to accelerate history. And I guess it's the same for an organization. Could probably accelerate the direction or of an organization. Alex, were you?
Yeah, it's just the old thing, isn't it? I think in a world that is still absolutely obsessed by the hero, a crisis needs a hero, right? And a crisis, I think, as much as we are beautifully thinking and contemplating, in a crisis we go fixer mode. There's a hole, it needs to be filled. And rather than going, that hole is there, that hole will stay. So think about it a bit more like grief. That hole will always be there. How do we weave around it to carry that hole and to have a beautifully crocheted blanket? I have just lost my analogies, but you know what I mean. So I think that is it's a muscle memory that we just have to at times. And I work as a creative consultant. I work at the moment with quite a lot of companies who have asked me to hold that space of thinking and not that space of fixing, and to allow them to come to those sessions with a creator mind and not a hero mind. It's hard. I totally acknowledge it's really hard.
Here's a wacky question. Oh, actually, I just saw Matt.
I did just unmute because I just had a final thought about it. I understand what you mean, Simon, about how do you kind of almost justify that time, protected time for working on, for example, some design work maybe. But I think that's something that happens in consequence scanning, and consequence scanning is something that we're not dropping off of our kind of schedule, because whether or not we actually end up with some answering questions that we had ahead of a session, we time box that session. The team is committed to being there and joining in, and I just think you have to protect that time, and maybe the conversation will be diverted to something else that takes precedence. But I think if you can time box that time for your organization with the intention of talking about design maybe, but going down a different route, then that's still okay. I think that's happened to us a lot on the last few weeks. We've been very much diverted off. path.
Mm. Yeah, I'd say time boxing time away from anything that's doing is very difficult for, I think, all organizations, but especially in a crisis. Kat, you've got a question.
Hi, my little one is in the background making some noise, which is why I've been off camera and on mute. I just wanted to pick up something that Alex just said around the idea of the hero, just to reflect some things that I'm seeing changing right now, which I hope will be a long-term change, because I often find that the hero idea comes from a place of thinking that it is possible for one actor to change and have an effect on something, whereas right now we're in this context where collective action feels like it's actually the only way. And so what can we do? I just really enjoyed hearing from Lynn and her very articulate way of talking about the community engagement and how important that's been in the journey for Open Food Network. And yeah, I just wonder what we can do together to really recognize where we see people moving away from that hero idea and towards more of a collective narrative, I guess, a collective tangible action.
Thanks, Kat. If that speaks to anyone, any of our panelists, we start to be wrapping up, so kind of closing comments. Lynn, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I guess like the main thing that I've done and I've seen people do for that hero's journey thing is the inner work, right? The yeah, I think we all carry that part of us inside that wants to be the hero, that struggles with community, yeah, like being that example and asking those questions and creating that space through our own personal journeys is probably the only thing I've ever seen that makes that happen. And that often that does involve the difficult conversations and the person who still wanted to be the hero after everybody else went into community mode for a period of time, or it's always messy, it's never simple, but that I think is one of the main things that we can do as individuals to build community.
Charlotte or Matt or Alex, what do you want to kind of finish with? Any closing reflections?
I love that, Lynn. Thank you. I also feel that there's something about being kind to ourselves, because these are new processes that we're trying to learn. Anything in the design thinking realm or consequence scanning realm, you're learning a new way of thinking, and you're trying to habituate your mind to that. And you're not going to be perfect at it first time. And some design sessions that we ran as a team for our first time, my God, they were all they've been a bit painful. And I've just really tried to get everybody to laugh about it afterwards, and to not go into kind of a low confidence space with it, because of course you can't be great at it first time. You have to build up that skill, and that just keep sharpening your saw, and really trusting your instincts and how street smart you are. And I think we do have our beneficiary, most of us will have our beneficiaries kind of embedded into our minds in such a deep way that we really will have an instinctual way of understanding what's right or what's wrong, or something speaking to us that's saying actually that's not a good way to go, and just really listening to those voices, those gut instincts.
I think in response to that question about kind of the hero journey, I think it all comes back to the question about collective responsibility of the organization, and checking in on that on a regular basis, because there is, the reason a lot of us are here, and maybe a grantee of National Lottery, is because the work that you're doing is you're a going concern. Your work is needed, and it's important that you're doing that work in a way that is maybe impacts other suppliers of people doing similar things to you, or the next generation of your digital development. But I think generally what's beneficial about the space that National Lottery is kind of creating for us now is, I think time is probably the best asset that the grant is actually giving us, that, you know, we're not being told strictly the outputs that we have to deliver on. It's about growing the organization from an organization that uses digital technology to more of a digital organization and has the language around consequence scanning and collective responsibility like ingrained in the nature of the organization. And I think if we do that successfully, I don't think we're at risk of going down the hero's journey. I think the organization will generally have a better understanding of what our need is and how best to deliver it. And then I had one final thought about responsible innovation, I guess, because that's kind of the whole overriding the headline here. And I don't have the space for this, but in my quarantine Netflix binging, I've actually found myself watching an explained episode on coding, and it's really easy watching, really enjoyable, and I recommend it. And the kind of takeaway point from there is in every web page, every app that you open, every line of code that would have gone into that is written by a human. There's a human behind everything you're doing online. This Zoom call is not a technology, it's, you know, there's a human behind it. And I find that really grounding when we're doing all elements of the project we're working on now, and then having these conversations. It just makes it all make sense.
That's a lovely closing image. Alex, if you want to, do you have anything you want to say before we finish off? No. No. Okay, perfect. We can finish with that. Yeah, that image of every piece of code as a human behind it. I think that's great. And I think for us, from the kind of lottery perspective, there's a real role to play as funders, and I think that's part of what, you know, we hope other funders might look at how we've done some of the things at the Digital Fund, and yeah, maybe be interested in replicating, because I think, yeah, one of the parts of what we've done, which I think can encourage navigation of complexity, like the topic that we're discussing. Like, these are complex issues, and if you attach strict KPIs and like a lack of kind of wiggle room or understanding around the wiggly path that different organizations are going to take, and need to, you know, take time where maybe output is not as high, but actually the thinking that's being done and the sensing that's being done is really significant and will have these long-term payoffs, then I guess it's centered around trust and kind of funding grant holders that you really trust to take their time and to use space to think and I think also feel, because a lot of this stuff is a bit more like a belly, like building a bit of a belly feeling about consequences and principles and ethics. But that is that's all. So it's been really, really nice to have all of you, and I hope that you enjoyed yourselves, and we'll be back next month with the topic of what is essential, which is quite an exciting and relevant topic, I think, right now. So hope to see you next month. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Phoebe.
Bye. Thanks, Phoebe.
Thank you.
Bye.